Damian Cross had built empires by understanding one fundamental truth. Every man had a weakness, and that weakness could be weaponized. He'd turned struggling startups into billion-dollar juggernauts, crushed competitors who thought themselves untouchable, and walked away from negotiations where grown men wept into their lawyers' shoulders. But tonight's mission carried a weight no boardroom battle ever had. Tonight wasn't about profit margins or market dominance. Tonight was about protecting his wife from the man who'd spent 7 years convincing her she was worthless. Marcus Sterling thought he'd humiliate Elena at their high school reunion, parade her as a cautionary tale of wasted potential and moral compromise. He didn't know Damian had spent 6 months engineering his complete annihilation. By midnight, Marcus wouldn't just lose his reputation. He'd lose his freedom, his career, and every illusion of control he'd built his pathetic existence upon. The nightmare always started the same way. Damian would wake at 3 in the morning to Elena's voice fracturing the silence, her body rigid beside him, hands clutching sheets twisted into knots. Tonight was no different. Her words came in broken gasps, fragments of conversations that lived somewhere between memory and terror. "I'm not nothing. I'm not nothing. Please stop saying I'm nothing." The sheer helplessness in her tone made something violent stir in Damian's chest, a protective rage he'd learned to channel into calculated action rather than brute force. He wrapped his arms around her carefully like she was something precious and breakable, because in these moments she was. Her eyes opened unfocused and wet, searching the darkness for threats that no longer existed in their penthouse sanctuary overlooking Chicago's glittering skyline. "I'm here. You're safe." His voice came out rougher than intended, damaged by the sight of her fear. Elena's breathing gradually slowed, her trembling easing as consciousness returned and displaced whatever horrors played behind her closed eyelids. She pressed her face against his chest, and he felt the dampness of tears soaking through his shirt. They'd been married 4 years. The nightmares had decreased in frequency, but they never fully disappeared. Marcus Sterling's voice still echoed in her subconscious, that smooth baritone that had once whispered promises and later wielded criticism like surgical instruments designed to excise self-worth without leaving visible scars. Damian had heard recordings. He'd listened to voicemails Elena saved, evidence of systematic emotional dismemberment disguised as concern. "I'm worried about you, sweetheart. You're being too emotional again. No one else is going to put up with this." Each message was a masterclass in manipulation, and each one made Damian's jaw tighten with barely restrained fury. "I thought I was past this." Elena's whisper carried shame that made Damian's heart constrict. She pulled back slightly, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand in a gesture he recognized from their early days together, back when she apologized for taking up space in the world. 4 years and he's still in my head. Then we're getting him out. Permanently. Damian had made the decision right then, watching dawn break over Lake Michigan through floor-to-ceiling windows. He'd been planning something vague, some distant reckoning, when the right opportunity presented itself. But seeing Elena trapped in terror of a man who no longer had any legal claim to her existence, who nonetheless occupied territory in her mind, rent-free, crystallized his resolve into immediate action. He slipped from bed, crossed to the walk-in closet that was larger than the apartment Elena had shared with Marcus during their marriage, and opened the hidden safe behind a section of cedar paneling. Inside, wrapped in black velvet, was the object he'd been waiting to return to her. Grandmother's locket. Elena thought Marcus had forced her to pawn it during their divorce, one final act of cruelty designed to sever her connection to family history. She had no idea Damian had tracked it down 2 years ago, paid $25,000 for something worth maybe $800, and kept it hidden for the perfect moment. Tonight had just become that moment. Elena was sitting up when he returned the silk nightgown she wore, catching light in ways that reminded him why he'd fallen in love with her long before discovering she was secretly wealthy. Intelligence, grace, a quiet strength she'd been conditioned to suppress, but never truly lost. He sat beside her, opened his palm to reveal the locket, and watched her face transform through a sequence of emotions that would have brought lesser men to tears. Shock, disbelief, recognition, then something that looked like hope breaking through clouds after years of rain. "How did you—" Her fingers trembled as she reached for it, then stopped as if touching it might make it disappear. Marcus said the pawn shop melted it down. Marcus said a lot of things that were lies. This was just one more. Damien placed it in her palm, watched her trace the engraved initials on the front. M.A. Margaret Ashmore. The grandmother who'd escaped an abusive marriage in 1962 built a textile empire from nothing and created a trust fund that had compounded interest for decades. Elena had known her grandmother was wealthy, but not the scale. Not until 3 years ago, when lawyers appeared with documentation that Elena Hartley, now Elena Cross, was the sole beneficiary of an $800 million estate and the title of Duchess of Ashmore, a courtesy designation tied to property holdings that technically made her American aristocracy. I bought it back the month after we got married. I was waiting for the right time to give it to you. Why now? She opened the locket, found the photograph of Margaret still inside, preserved beneath aged glass. A woman in her 40s, elegant and unyielding, staring at the camera like she was daring it to find a flaw. Because you're going to that reunion tomorrow night, and you're going to face Marcus Sterling. And when you do, I want you wearing your grandmother's locket. Damien let the implications settle between them. Not just a piece of jewelry, a talisman, a reminder of the bloodline that flowed through her veins, the legacy of a woman who'd refused to let any man define her worth. But first, there's something else you need to see. The study was Damien's domain. All dark wood and leather screens mounted on walls displaying real-time market data from exchanges around the world. He pulled up a chair beside his desk, gestured for Elena to sit, then unlocked his computer and accessed files he'd been compiling in secret for half a year. 6 months ago, I hired a private investigator. I wanted to know everything about Marcus Sterling, where he ate lunch, who he called at 2 in the morning, what websites he visited when he thought no one was watching. He opened the first folder, revealing financial records that told a story of systematic fraud disguised as legitimate legal practice. Turns out your ex-husband has been very busy and very stupid. Elena leaned forward, scanning documents that detailed shell companies' offshore accounts, wire transfers that created a paper trail even a first-year law student could follow. Her expression shifted from confusion to comprehension to something that looked like vindication. He's laundering money. For Victor Castellano's organization, among others, using a shell company called Hartley Arts, LLC. Damien let that sink in, watched her process the implications. Marcus had used her maiden name, her identity, as cover for criminal activity. Identity theft layered on top of money laundering, compounding felonies like interest on bad debt. He was careless, Elena, arrogant. He thought he was untouchable because he'd gotten away with abusing you for a decade. He assumed the same impunity applied to defrauding the federal government. How long has this been going on? Her voice had changed, losing the tentative quality that lingered in the mornings after nightmares. This was the Elena who sat on the board of the Art Institute of Chicago, who'd brokered a $2 million acquisition from a Boston collector who'd earned her Ph.D. from Northwestern by writing a 300-page dissertation that got published in peer-reviewed journals. The woman Marcus had tried to convince didn't exist. Best we can tell, he started in 2018, a year after your divorce finalized. He was desperate for cash, probably because he'd lost access to your grandmother's inheritance money he'd been spending like it was his own. Damien opened another file, this one containing email threads between Marcus and associates who were careful never to explicitly mention illegal activity, but whose coded language was transparent to anyone with basic pattern recognition. I shared everything with a contact at the FBI, Agent Morrison. We went to Columbia together. He's been building a case, but he needs something more immediate, more concrete. He needs Marcus to incriminate himself in real time on recording in a way that can't be explained away by clever attorneys. Elena's eyes met his understanding, crystallizing. The reunion. Marcus will be there. He'll have an audience of people who knew you both in high school, people who remember you as the quiet art student and him as the star debater. He'll see you walk in, and every insecurity he's been nursing for 4 years will activate. The knowledge that you married a billionaire, that you're now wealthier than he'll ever be, that you escaped his control and thrived. Damien had studied Marcus Sterling the way a hunter studies prey, learning behavioral patterns, identifying triggers, mapping the ecosystem of ego and resentment that governed his decision-making. He won't be able to help himself. He'll attack you publicly, try to rewrite history with you as the villain and him as the wounded party. And when he does, we'll be recording every word. You want me to wear a wire? It wasn't a question. Elena understood the proposal instantly, her mind already running scenarios, calculating risks and probabilities. She'd always been brilliant long before Marcus convinced her otherwise. Damien had simply created conditions where she could remember that fact. I want you to have the option. Morrison can provide equipment, something subtle embedded in jewelry or accessories. You wear it to the reunion, let Marcus talk, let him perform his character assassination routine for his old friends. He'll incriminate himself eventually. Men like him always do when they think they're winning. Damien pulled up a final file, this one containing surveillance photographs of Marcus meeting with known associates of the Castellano crime family at restaurants throughout Chicago's South Side. The FBI has been patient, but they're ready to move. They just need that last piece of evidence that ties Marcus directly to knowing participation in criminal conspiracy. His voice, his words, his admission. Elena stared at the photographs, her face unreadable. Damien knew what she was weighing: safety versus justice, the comfort of avoiding confrontation versus the liberation of finally definitively proving that Marcus Sterling's version of their shared history was fiction designed to absolve him of accountability. She'd spent years in therapy learning to recognize gaslighting, to trust her own memories, to separate his narratives from objective reality. This would be the final exam. Walking into a room full of witnesses who might believe Marcus's lies, standing firm in her truth, and letting him destroy himself with his own words. What if he doesn't take the bait? What if he sees me and just ignores me? The question revealed lingering insecurity, the voice of the woman who'd been conditioned to believe she wasn't important enough to merit attention. He won't ignore you. He can't. You're everything he wanted to possess and failed to break. You're proof that his entire worldview is built on quicksand. Damien reached across the desk, covered her hand with his. Marcus Sterling needs you to be broken, Elena. He needs you to be the woman who made bad choices and ruined her own potential, because if you're not that woman, then he has to confront what he actually is. A mediocre man who stole from someone extraordinary and called it partnership. The words settled between them, and Damien saw the shift in her posture, the way her spine straightened and her jaw set with determination that reminded him why he'd fallen in love with her in the first place. She wasn't a victim waiting to be saved. She was a survivor who'd rebuilt herself from ashes, and all she'd needed was someone willing to stand beside her instead of in front of her. Okay, I'll do it. I'll wear the wire. I'll go to that reunion, and I'll let him talk. Her fingers closed around the locket, and when she looked at Damien, he saw something fierce and beautiful in her expression. But I need you to promise me something. Anything. Don't come in to save me, not until it's finished. I need to face him alone, prove to myself that I can stand in the same room without falling apart. Can you do that? Can you let me handle this without intervening? The question was a test, and they both knew it. Every instinct Damien possessed screamed at him to reject the proposal, to insist on being there from the start, to position himself as the shield between Elena and any potential harm. But he'd learned something crucial in 4 years of marriage protection. Wasn't about control. It was about creating conditions where the person you loved could protect themselves. I'll be there, but I'll stay back until you're ready. You set the timeline, you give the signal. This is your moment, Elena. I'm just making sure you have the tools to finish it. He meant every word, even as part of him raged against the idea of her facing Marcus without immediate backup. But this wasn't about his comfort. It was about her reclaiming autonomy that had been systematically stripped away by a man who'd learned early that the best way to control someone was to convince them they needed controlling. The rest of the morning passed in preparation. Damien made calls to Agent Morrison, arranged for equipment drop-off, coordinated timing and logistics with the precision he usually reserved for hostile takeovers of underperforming companies. Morrison was enthusiastic, almost gleeful at the prospect of finally nailing Marcus Sterling to the wall. Apparently, Sterling had been on the FBI's radar for 3 years, ever since an accountant at his firm filed a suspicious activity report that mysteriously disappeared before reaching proper channels. The accountant had later recanted, claimed it was a misunderstanding, and then quietly moved to Oregon, where she now worked at a bookstore, and refused to discuss her former employer. Classic intimidation pattern. Damien had tracked her down, offered her immunity and financial compensation if she'd testify when the time came. She'd accepted. Another piece on the chessboard positioned and waiting. By noon, Damien was reviewing Marcus Sterling's social media presence, archived posts that painted a picture of a man obsessed with projecting success while hemorrhaging money and credibility in private. Photographs of expensive dinners, luxury watches, trips to Miami and Las Vegas, all captioned with inspirational quotes about grinding and winning and never settling for less. The comments section was a graveyard of aspiring attorneys seeking mentorship, small business owners asking for legal advice, women in their 20s complimenting his ambition. Marcus had cultivated an image of the self-made man, the fighter who'd overcome humble beginnings through sheer determination. The mythology was seductive, especially to people who didn't know that his law school tuition had been paid with Elena's inheritance money, that his first office lease had been secured using her grandmother's trust as collateral, that every hustle he celebrated had been subsidized by someone else's sacrifice. Damien found the post from 3 months ago, the one that had pushed him from passive observation to active intervention. A long-form essay disguised as personal reflection titled "The Gold Digger Epidemic, A Cautionary Tale." Marcus never mentioned Elena by name, but the details were specific enough that anyone who'd known them both would recognize the target. "I once loved someone with limitless potential. An artist, brilliant, could have been anything, but fear paralyzed her. She chose security over struggle, a gilded cage over freedom. I see her now in her expensive clothes and her beautiful prison, and I mourn the woman she could have been. Sometimes the greatest tragedy isn't failure. It's surrender." The post had gotten 4,000 likes, hundreds of comments from people praising Marcus's vulnerability and wisdom. Damien had read it and felt something cold and murderous settle in his chest. Not rage. Rage was hot and impulsive. This was surgical calculation, the kind of focused intent that turned markets and ended careers. He'd called his media team that afternoon, the same people who managed cross-enterprises, public relations, and crisis communications. Within 2 hours, they'd drafted a complete dossier on Marcus Sterling, documenting every lie, every manipulation, every instance where public statements contradicted provable facts. Damien had it ready to deploy the moment legal considerations were satisfied. Once Marcus was arrested, once the FBI's case was public record, there would be nothing stopping Damien from systematically destroying whatever remained of Sterling's reputation. But that required patience. It required letting Marcus think he was still winning, still in control, still the smartest person in every room he entered. Elena spent the afternoon with Vivian Hayes, her closest friend since kindergarten, and one of the few people from high school who'd maintained contact after the divorce. Vivian was a pediatrician, now married with 2 kids, living the stable suburban life that had once seemed like Elena's trajectory before Marcus Sterling convinced her that wanting normalcy was a failure of imagination. Damien had met Vivian twice, liked her immediately for her no-nonsense attitude and the way she looked at Elena like a sister rather than a source of reflected status. She'd been the one who showed up at the emergency room 7 years ago, the night Elena overdosed on sleeping pills, and Marcus told the attending physician that his wife was just being dramatic again before leaving to attend a client dinner. Vivian had stayed. She'd held Elena's hand while they pumped her stomach, lied to hospital administrators about next of kin, and then driven Elena to her own house where she'd stayed for 3 weeks, while filing divorce papers and restraining orders that Marcus's attorney friends helped him violate with impunity. They met for lunch at a cafe in Lincoln Park, the kind of place where everything cost twice what it should, and people paid for the privilege of being seen in the right neighborhood. Damien watched from across the street, sitting in his Aston Martin with tinted windows, monitoring a situation he had no rational reason to monitor. Protective instinct had evolved into something more complicated over the years. He trusted Elena completely. He didn't trust the world not to hurt her. Through the cafe's large windows he could see Vivian's animated gestures, the way she leaned forward with intensity, clearly saying something important. Elena listened, nodded, smiled at something that made her shoulders relax fractionally. Good. She needed allies tomorrow night, people in that room who knew the truth and wouldn't be swayed by Marcus's performance. His phone buzzed with a text from Vivian, a number he'd programmed months ago specifically for coordination purposes. She told me about the plan. I'm in. Whatever you need. Damien smiled, typed back a response. Bring your phone fully charged. If the wire fails, we need backup audio. Record everything you can. Vivian's reply came instantly. Already planned on it. I've been waiting 7 years for this. Damien believed her. He'd seen the look in her eyes the one time they'd discussed Marcus, the barely contained fury of someone who'd witnessed abuse and been powerless to stop it. Tomorrow night she'd have power. They all would. Evening came with the particular quality of light that made Chicago look like a city from someone else's dreams. All gold and shadow and architectural ambition. Damien cooked dinner, something he rarely had time for but enjoyed when circumstances aligned. Pan-seared salmon, asparagus, wild rice. Simple, elegant, the kind of meal that said, I care about you, without requiring poetry or grand gestures. Elena set the table, moving through their penthouse with a grace that still occasionally caught him off guard. She'd grown into her wealth in ways that impressed him. No ostentation, no nouveau riche desperation to prove she belonged in rarefied spaces. She wore designer clothes like they were comfortable cotton-treated staff with respect that came from remembering what it felt like to be dismissed, donated more money than she spent, and did it quietly without needing recognition or tax write-offs. They ate in comfortable silence, the kind that only developed after years of learning someone's rhythms and respecting their interior landscape. Damien had dated before Elena relationships with women who were beautiful and intelligent and utterly wrong for him in ways he'd only recognized in retrospect. They'd wanted the version of him that appeared in Forbes profiles, the titan of industry, the man who turned everything he touched into gold. Elena had met him at a police station, watching him volunteer time with domestic violence victims, offering legal resources and financial assistance to people trying to escape situations that looked remarkably like her own marriage. She'd seen him in a context completely divorced from wealth and power, and that had mattered. I've been thinking about what happens after. Elena's voice broke the silence, measured and thoughtful. After tomorrow night, after Marcus is arrested and everything becomes public, what does my life look like then? It was a question Damien had considered extensively. The FBI's case would generate media attention. Marcus Sterling, successful attorney, arrested for money laundering and fraud. His ex-wife secretly a duchess and married to a billionaire, presumably cooperating with federal investigators. The story had tabloid appeal, the kind of narrative that would dominate news cycles and spawn think pieces about class and gender and justice. Elena would be scrutinized, her past examined, her present questioned. People would have opinions, most of them wrong, many of them cruel. You'll be free, completely, finally free. He won't have any power over you, not even the power to occupy space in your nightmares. Everything else is just noise. What if people believe his version? What if they think I'm vindictive, that I'm using my money and your connections to destroy a man who just made some mistakes? Her concern was valid. Public opinion had its own logic, often inversely proportional to actual facts. Women who reported abuse were routinely accused of lying, exaggerating, seeking attention or revenge. The dynamic would be amplified by wealth disparities, by the fact that Elena had resources most victims could never access. Then those people are wrong and their opinions are irrelevant. The FBI doesn't arrest people because an ex-wife has hurt feelings. They arrest people because crimes were committed and evidence exists. Marcus is going to prison because he's a criminal, not because you're powerful. Damien had learned long ago to stop trying to control narratives beyond what facts and legal strategy allowed. Some people would believe whatever reinforced their existing worldview. Others could be persuaded by documentation. The rest didn't matter. But I won't lie and say it will be easy. There will be reporters, questions, people from your past offering to sell stories about you to anyone willing to pay. We'll handle it, together. Elena nodded, accepting the reality without flinching. That was another thing he loved about her. She didn't need false comfort or unrealistic promises. She needed honesty and partnership, the confidence that whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. "I want to write something. After it's over. Not a memoir, nothing sensational. Maybe an essay about financial abuse, about how controlling money is one of the primary tools abusers use to trap victims. I could publish it anonymously or under my name if it would help other people understand the pattern." The idea had merit. Elena's story, properly told, could illuminate dynamics that often remained invisible until after the damage was catastrophic. "I think that's brilliant, and I think you should use your name. Own your story completely, don't let anyone else frame it for you." They finished dinner, cleared dishes, and synchronized movements that spoke to years of domestic routine. Damien loaded the dishwasher while Elena wiped down counters, both of them occupied with mundane tasks that felt grounding in their ordinariness. Tomorrow would be chaos and confrontation and the violent reordering of reality. Tonight was theirs, peaceful and private, the calm that made weathering storms possible. Later, lying in bed with Elena curled against him, Damien reviewed his strategy one final time. The reunion started at 7. Elena would arrive at 7:30, fashionably late, giving Marcus time to settle in and feel comfortable. Agent Morrison would be stationed outside in an unmarked vehicle monitoring the wire's transmission, ready to move if Elena signaled distress or if Marcus's statements crossed thresholds that justified immediate intervention. Vivian would be inside recording backup audio on her phone, providing friendly presence and corroborating witness testimony if needed. Damien would attend the charity gala he'd committed to months ago, maintaining his alibi and public schedule, but he'd have his own security team positioned near Northgate Country Club with instructions to notify him immediately if the situation escalated beyond parameters. The one variable he couldn't control was Marcus himself. Damien had profiled him extensively, built psychological models based on observable behavior and documented patterns, but human beings retained capacity to surprise even the most thorough analysis. Marcus might ignore Elena completely, might refuse to engage in front of witnesses, might have evolved enough self-awareness to recognize the trap being set. Damien doubted it. Everything in Marcus Sterling's history suggested a man whose ego outweighed his judgment, whose need to be seen as superior would override any strategic caution. But doubt remained a small probability that tomorrow night would end, not with triumph but with anticlimactic restraint. Elena's breathing had evened into the rhythm of sleep, her body finally relaxed after a day spent preparing for battle. Damien stayed awake, watching shadows move across the ceiling, thinking about the first time he'd seen her. Not at the police station, though. That was the first time they'd spoken. He'd seen her weeks earlier at a fundraiser for the Art Institute, where she'd been working as a low-level consultant, barely making rent. She'd been standing in front of a Monet, utterly absorbed, oblivious to the wealthy patrons circulating around her. Something about her posture, the way she held herself like she was trying not to take up too much space, had caught his attention. He'd watched her for 20 minutes, fascinated by someone who could be in a room full of Chicago's elite and seem completely unaware of their existence. Later he'd learned that Marcus had convinced her she didn't belong in spaces like that her appreciation of art was amateur enthusiasm rather than legitimate expertise. By the time Damien met her formally, she'd been conditioned to apologize for having opinions. Rebuilding her confidence had been the work of years, not months. Therapy helped. Distance from Marcus helped more. But the real transformation came when Elena started remembering who she'd been before him, the girl who'd won state art competitions, who'd been accepted to prestigious programs with full scholarships, who'd had professors tell her she had genuine talent worth cultivating. Marcus had systematically erased that version of her, replacing her self-perception with his assessment: mediocre, emotional, lucky to be loved by someone willing to tolerate her limitations. Damien's role had been simpler than he'd initially understood. He didn't need to fix her or save her or complete her. He just needed to consistently reflect back the truth until she could see it herself. "You're brilliant. Your instincts are sound. You have nothing to apologize for." Simple statements repeated until they sank beneath defensive layers and touched something authentic. The locket lay on her nightstand, Grandmother Margaret's stern face visible through the glass. Damien picked it up carefully, opened it, studied the photograph. Margaret Ashmore had divorced her husband in 1962, when divorce still carried stigma, capable of destroying women socially and financially. She'd fought for custody of her daughter Elena's mother, and won despite having fewer legal resources. Then she'd built a textile business from a single sewing machine, growing it into a company that supplied fabric to major fashion houses before selling for a sum that established the trust fund Elena had inherited. The journal Elena had read Margaret's private writings contained passages that could have been describing Elena's own experience. "He said I was nothing without him. I believed it until I wasn't with him anymore. Then I became everything I'd always been, just louder." The parallel was almost eerie genetic echo across generations. Damien set the locket down, settled back against pillows that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and allowed himself to imagine tomorrow's outcome. Marcus arrested, Elena vindicated. The beginning of the end of a nightmare that had lasted far too long. But beneath the satisfaction of anticipated justice, he felt something else. Concern. Because he knew what Elena didn't fully accept yet. Destroying Marcus Sterling wouldn't erase the damage. It wouldn't undo years of conditioning or magically restore neural pathways that had been rewired by sustained psychological abuse. It would be cathartic, certainly. It would provide closure and proof that reality validated her memories rather than his revisions. But healing would still require time and effort and patience that extended beyond any single confrontation, however decisive. His phone lit up with a message from Agent Morrison, time-stamped near midnight. "Equipment ready. Drop off tomorrow at 4 p.m. Make sure she tests it before the event. Audio quality is excellent, but battery life is limited to 6 hours." Damien confirmed receipt, added a note about backup recording via Vivian's phone. Morrison replied with a thumbs-up emoji, incongruous from a federal agent, but somehow perfect for the strange intimacy of conspiracy between people united by common purpose. They were all protecting Elena now, a network of support that had nothing to do with her wealth or status, and everything to do with the basic human obligation to stand against cruelty when given opportunity. Sleep came eventually, though Damien's dreams were populated by scenarios where things went wrong. Marcus recognizing the wire. Technical failures. Elena's courage faltering at the crucial moment. He woke before dawn, checked his phone compulsively for messages that didn't exist, and finally gave up on rest in favor of productivity. The markets had opened in London. He had calls scheduled with analysts in Singapore. Normal life continued even as personal vendettas reached critical mass. He worked from his home office, half his attention on currency fluctuations and the other half on the woman still sleeping down the hall, preparing to face demons that had teeth and voices and permanent addresses in Chicago's legal district. By the time Elena emerged, showered and dressed in casual clothes that still managed to look elegant, Damien had already moved 8 figures across 3 continents and restructured a portfolio that would fund a small nation's annual budget. She poured coffee, kissed his cheek, asked about his morning with the easy affection of someone who'd learned that his intensity wasn't rejection of her presence, but simply how his mind processed information. "Agent Morrison is dropping off the equipment at 4. You should probably eat something before then. Nerves are going to make the afternoon difficult." He said it gently but firmly. Elena had a tendency to skip meals when anxious, a holdover from years when Marcus criticized her weight and food became fraught with judgment. "I'm okay. Vivian and I are meeting for lunch again. She wants to coordinate our stories, make sure we're not contradicting each other if anyone asks questions." Elena's strategic thinking had sharpened considerably in recent years. She understood the importance of consistency, the way small discrepancies could be weaponized against credibility. "She's bringing her husband. Apparently he wants to meet you formally. Thank you for helping with his mother's legal situation last year." Damien remembered the case. Vivian's mother-in-law had been defrauded by a contractor who'd taken payment for roof repairs and disappeared. Standard civil case, except the contractor had connections to organized crime and was using intimidation tactics to prevent victims from filing complaints. Damien had connected the family with attorneys who specialized in consumer protection and weren't afraid of implicit threats. The contractor was now serving time for wire fraud. The mother-in-law had recovered her money. These were the kinds of interventions Damien made regularly, using resources to solve problems that would overwhelm people with less access. It cost him nothing. It meant everything to recipients. Tell him it was nothing. We help people when we can. That's what money is supposed to be for. The afternoon progressed with agonizing slowness. Damien attended a conference call with investors who wanted to know why Cross Enterprises was acquiring a struggling publishing house. He told them it was a long-term play on content verticals and strategic media positioning. He didn't mention that Marcus Sterling had a book deal with said publishing house, a memoir full of lies that would now never see print. The acquisition would be finalized next week. The editor who'd signed Marcus would be terminated for inadequate fact-checking. These were the advantages of wealth deployed with precision. You could reshape reality in ways that seemed coincidental until the pattern emerged, and by then it was too late for targets to mount effective defense. Agent Morrison arrived exactly at 4, driving an unmarked sedan that screamed federal agent to anyone with basic observational skills. He was mid-40s, graying at the temples, carrying himself with the particular confidence of someone who'd sent powerful people to prison and had the case files to prove it. Damien met him in the lobby, shook hands with the grip of men who understood that respect was earned through action rather than declaration. "Everything ready?" Morrison's question was rhetorical. He wouldn't be here if preparations were incomplete. But Damien appreciated the gesture, the acknowledgement that this operation was collaborative rather than hierarchical. "Elena's upstairs. She's ready." Damien led Morrison to the private elevator, the one that required both keycard and biometric scan, that opened directly into their penthouse rather than any common hallway. Security measures that had seemed excessive when the building was designed but proved their worth regularly. Threats came in various forms. Physical security was the baseline requirement for people whose net worth attracted attention from criminals, journalists, and the simply desperate. Elena was waiting in the living room wearing the sapphire dress she'd selected for the reunion. The color made her eyes look like backlit gemstones, and the cut suggested elegance without ostentation. She'd learned to dress her status without performing at a subtle distinction that separated old money from new. Agent Morrison's eyebrows rose fractionally in appreciation before professional neutrality reasserted itself. "Mrs. Cross, thank you for agreeing to assist with this investigation." His tone was formal, appropriate for documenting cooperation that might later require testimony. "I want him stopped. If this helps accomplish that, then it's the least I can do." Elena's voice carried steel that hadn't been there 4 years ago. Damien felt pride mixed with something more complex. She'd rebuilt herself so thoroughly that sometimes he forgot how fragile she'd been when they met, how close she'd come to disappearing entirely. Morrison opened his case, revealing what looked like an expensive necklace. $4 million worth of Ashmore family diamonds, genuine heirlooms from Elena's grandmother's estate, now serving double duty as surveillance equipment. The modification had been done by FBI technicians who specialized in covert recording devices. The microphone was embedded in the clasp, invisible, unless you knew exactly where to look. Battery life was rated for 8 hours. Audio quality was supposedly exceptional. "You'll need to test it. Speak normally, move around, simulate conversation. We need to confirm transmission is clear before you walk into that room." For the next 30 minutes, Damien's penthouse became an impromptu testing facility. Elena wore the necklace, spoke into the hidden microphone, moved from room to room, while Morrison monitored reception quality on equipment that looked like it belonged in a spy film. The results were perfect. Every word crisp, every nuance audible. Even whispered statements came through with clarity that would satisfy any court's evidentiary standards. "This is good work," Morrison said, finally closing his equipment case with satisfaction. "Better than most cases I've run. Sterling won't suspect a thing." "What's the threshold for intervention?" Damien had asked this question 3 times already, but needed confirmation one final time. The last thing he wanted was premature action that would spook Marcus before he'd fully incriminated himself. Explicit acknowledgement of criminal activity or clear threat of physical harm to Mrs. Cross. Anything less, we wait. Let him talk. Let him perform. Men like Sterling can't help themselves when they think they have a captive audience. He'll say something actionable. They always do. Morrison's confidence was born from experience. 20 years running financial crimes investigations had taught him that criminals were fundamentally predictable. They thought themselves smarter than the systems designed to catch them. That arrogance was the weakness that made prosecution possible. After Morrison left, Damien helped Elena remove the necklace, carefully returned it to its case lined with velvet. "You don't have to do this. Even now you can change your mind. We'll find another way." He meant it. If Elena walked away from this entire plan, Damien would pivot immediately to alternative strategies. Her safety and well-being mattered more than any satisfaction justice might provide. "I need to do this. For me. To prove that I can stand in the same room with him and not fall apart. To know that his voice doesn't have power over me anymore." Elena's determination was absolute. Damien recognized it from business negotiations where the other party had decided on a course of action and no amount of persuasion would shift them. He could only respect the decision and provide support. The charity gala started at 7. Damien dressed in the Tom Ford tuxedo that Elena had selected, the one that made him look like he belonged on magazine covers instead of boardrooms. She adjusted his bow tie with practiced fingers, smiled at him in the mirror with affection that still sometimes felt miraculous. "Thank you for all of this, for believing me when I didn't believe myself." Her gratitude landed like a physical weight. Damien turned, pulled her close, rested his forehead against hers in a gesture of intimacy that required no words. "Always. Whatever you need, whenever you need it. That's what this is." He meant marriage partnership, the promise they'd made to each other 4 years ago in a ceremony so private that only Vivian and the officiant had attended. No spectacle, no performance. Just two people who'd found each other in circumstances designed to prevent connection, choosing to build something permanent. The driver was waiting downstairs, town car polished to mirror finish, ready to transport Damien to the Children's Hospital Gala, where he'd make an appearance, write a check, and excuse himself early, citing urgent business. The cover story was already established. Anyone who asked would hear that Cross Enterprises was finalizing an acquisition in Singapore and time zones required his immediate attention. No one would question it. Billionaires kept irregular hours. Their absence was as unremarkable as their presence. Elena would take a separate car to Northgate Country Club, arriving at 7:30 when the reunion was fully underway, and Marcus would be comfortable, relaxed, surrounded by admirers and sycophants who'd spent the last decade hearing his carefully curated version of reality. She'd walk in wearing her grandmother's locket and $4 million worth of diamonds rigged with FBI surveillance equipment. She'd face the man who'd spent 7 years convincing her she was worthless, and she'd prove finally and definitively that his assessment had always been the lie of someone who needed her diminished to feel adequate himself. Damien kissed her one last time before leaving, tasting her lipstick, and fear and determination mixed into something that felt like the beginning of an ending. "I'll be listening. The moment you need me, I'm there. No hesitation." His security team had instructions. Monitor FBI channels. Track Elena's location via her phone. Be ready to move on 5 seconds' notice. Damien had built redundancy into every system because failure wasn't acceptable when the person you loved was walking into a situation designed to provoke the worst from someone who'd already proven himself capable of profound cruelty. The gala was exactly as tedious as expected. Rich people congratulating each other for donating money they'd never missed, children's hospital administrators offering gratitude that was genuine but exhausting to receive repeatedly. Damien smiled, shook hands, wrote a check for $500,000, and maintained the fiction that he was fully present instead of monitoring his phone compulsively for updates that hadn't arrived. 7:45. Elena would be at the country club now, walking through doors, seeing familiar faces, searching the room for Marcus Sterling, finding him, making eye contact. Damien's phone buzzed. Text from Vivian. "She's here. Looks incredible. MS spotted her. Game on." 3 simple sentences that made Damien's pulse spike despite years of training himself to maintain composure under pressure. It was happening. Years of planning, months of investigation, weeks of preparation, all converging on a single evening where truth would collide with lies and only one version of reality would survive. He excused himself from a conversation with a hedge fund manager who wanted advice on tech investments, found a quiet corner, and opened the audio monitoring app Agent Morrison had installed on his phone. The connection was encrypted, the feed live, and suddenly Damien could hear everything. Ambient noise of a crowded room. Background music. Conversations overlapping in ways that made individual words difficult to parse. Then Elena's voice, clear and steady, speaking to someone Damien couldn't identify. "It's good to see you too. No, I'm here alone." Damien had a prior commitment. The lie came smoothly practiced and delivered with the casual confidence of someone who'd learned that controlling information was its own form of power. Then another voicemail familiar from recordings Damien had analyzed until he could identify Marcus Sterling's vocal patterns in his sleep. "Elena, I almost didn't recognize you. You look different." The tone carried implications. Different meant better, meant transformed, meant unrecognizable from the broken woman Marcus remembered. And beneath the observation, Damien heard something else: resentment. The shock of someone encountering evidence that their victim had not just survived but thrived in their absence. Elena's response was measured, perfectly calibrated. "Hello, Marcus. You haven't changed at all." The statement was neutral enough to pass for pleasantry while carrying enough edge to cut if Marcus was paying attention. Damien smiled despite the tension coiling in his shoulders. She was handling this. Already in the first 30 seconds, she'd established that she wouldn't be intimidated or manipulated into apologetic postures. Still the same old Marcus, working hard, fighting the good fight. Marcus's voice had taken on the smooth quality Damien recognized from depositions and interviews. Performance mode, the version of himself he presented to audiences he wanted to impress. "So I heard congratulations are in order. You married Damien Cross. That's impressive." And the pause before impressive carried worlds of meaning. Not impressive as achievement, but impressive as calculation. Impressive as strategy. Impressive as confirmation of every suspicion Marcus had nurtured about Elena's character and motivations. Damien's jaw tightened, but he stayed silent, listening, trusting Elena to navigate waters she'd been preparing for. "I'm very happy, Marcus." Elena's response was simple, refusing to take bait that hadn't quite been offered explicitly. She understood the game. Don't defend, don't explain, don't give him ammunition disguised as conversation. In the background, Damien heard other voices. Other conversations, the acoustic texture of a high school reunion where middle-aged people pretended the last decade had been kinder than evidence suggested. He heard someone laugh, someone call for attention, someone clinking glass against glass in preparation for toasts. And beneath it all, he heard the wire's faithful transmission capturing everything, building a record that would outlast memory and survive cross-examination. The real confrontation was beginning. Damien closed his eyes, leaned back against the hospital's marble wall, and listened as the woman he loved walked into fire carrying nothing but truth and the certainty that she deserved better than what Marcus Sterling had ever been capable of providing. The surveillance feed crackled with ambient noise as Damien stood motionless in the hospital's deserted corridor, phone pressed against his ear like a lifeline to a reality unfolding 15 miles away. Marcus Sterling's voice came through with crystalline clarity, each syllable dripping with the performative charm Damien had studied across dozens of recorded depositions and client consultations. The man was a chameleon, shifting presentations to match audience expectations, and right now his audience consisted of 50 former classmates who remembered him as the debate team captain destined for greatness. "You know what I miss most about our time together?" Marcus's tone had shifted into something resembling nostalgia, though Damien detected calculation beneath the wistfulness. "Those Friday nights in our apartment in Wrigleyville. Remember how we'd count pennies just to afford pizza? We were broke but happy, building something real together." Elena's silence stretched long enough that Damien's hand tightened around his phone. He could picture her processing the manipulation, recognizing the trap being constructed in real time. Marcus was establishing a narrative for their witnesses, painting himself as the humble dreamer and Elena as someone who'd abandoned authentic struggle for manufactured comfort. The strategy was transparent to anyone trained to recognize emotional manipulation, but most people weren't trained. Most people heard a man reminiscing about simpler times and assumed sincerity rather than weaponized sentimentality. "I remember that apartment very clearly." Elena's voice carried undertones Damien had learned to recognize over 4 years of marriage. She was buying time, analyzing Marcus's opening gambit, preparing her response with the strategic patience he'd watched her develop through therapy and painful self-examination. "I remember a lot of things about those years." The subtle emphasis on "a lot" was masterful, not defensive, not aggressive, just a quiet reminder that shared history contained multitudes, and Marcus didn't control which memories merited examination. Damien allowed himself a moment of pride before anxiety reasserted itself. They were still in the opening moves of a confrontation that could escalate unpredictably. Marcus Sterling was cornered whether he knew it yet or not, and cornered animals became dangerous in proportion to their desperation. Background noise shifted as someone apparently pulled Marcus away for another conversation. Damien heard fragments of male voices discussing fantasy football and real estate markets, the universal language of men approaching 40 who measured success in tangible acquisitions. Then Vivian's voice emerged closer to the microphone than previous speakers. "You okay? You want to get some air?" "I'm fine, just processing." Elena's response was quiet but firm. "He looks exactly the same. Same haircut, same suit style, same expression, like he's the smartest person in every room he enters. That expression is going to look different when federal agents introduce him to handcuffs." Vivian's venom was poorly disguised. Damien appreciated her loyalty even as he worried about her control. Effective allies maintained composure. Rage, however justified, created vulnerabilities opponents could exploit. The country club's acoustics changed, suggesting movement from the main ballroom toward what Damien's advance reconnaissance had identified as a terrace overlooking the golf course. He heard the distinct sound of French doors opening, then ambient noise decreasing as Elena and Vivian stepped into relative privacy. This wasn't in the plan. Morrison wanted Elena circulating, engaging with witnesses, creating opportunities for Marcus to incriminate himself before a crowd. Isolated conversations served different purposes, potentially useful, but tactically risky. "Bethany Price cornered me near the bar." Elena's voice carried disgust that needed no elaboration. Damien had reviewed Bethany's social media extensively during his investigation. Former cheerleader turned serial bride, currently on her 3rd marriage to a commercial real estate developer whose business was hemorrhaging money faster than his wife could spend it. She'd cultivated an influencer presence built on aspirational lifestyle content that masked profound insecurity. She asked if Damien bought me or if I came with a warranty. "Please tell me you destroyed her." Vivian's protective fury was palpable even through encrypted audio transmission. "I told her I was happy and asked if she was. She hasn't stopped crying in the bathroom since." Elena's delivery was matter-of-fact, reporting outcomes without celebrating cruelty. She'd learned to defend herself without becoming the aggressor, a distinction that mattered legally and morally. Damien made a mental note to send flowers to whoever had helped Bethany reach that particular emotional breaking point. Their conversation shifted toward logistics and timing. Vivian confirmed her phone was recording battery life sufficient for several more hours. She'd positioned herself strategically near Marcus's usual orbit, close enough to overhear his performances without being obvious about surveillance. Scott Reynolds had already approached her once, asking pointed questions about Elena's sudden wealth and whether the marriage was legitimate or transactional. Vivian had responded with medical precision, dissecting his misogyny until he'd retreated to safer company. Back inside the reunion was reaching the phase where alcohol loosened inhibitions and old hierarchies reasserted themselves. Damien heard someone proposing toasts, a suggestion that generated enthusiastic agreement from people who'd spent 15 years rehearsing speeches about their accomplishments. This was Marcus Sterling's natural environment. Give him a microphone and an audience, he became the version of himself he most wanted to believe in. Confident, successful, magnanimous in victory, and philosophical about setbacks. The performance was so practiced, it had calcified into something resembling authentic personality. "We should do a round of failures that made us." Scott Reynolds' voice carried the forced joviality of someone drinking past his tolerance threshold. Share the setbacks that taught us the most. Make it real, vulnerable. The idea generated enough positive response that resistance would have seemed antisocial. Damien recognized the setup immediately. Marcus had probably planted the suggestion with Scott earlier, creating plausible deniability for what was actually carefully orchestrated humiliation disguised as group therapy. Failures that made us would give Marcus permission to discuss his divorce, publicly framing Elena's departure as his greatest learning experience about the difference between genuine partnership and opportunistic transaction. Elena must have returned to the ballroom because ambient noise increased dramatically. Damien heard her ask someone for champagne, heard the bartender's response, heard the clink of glass and the rustle of fabric as she moved through crowds toward whatever confrontation was about to unfold. His own heart rate had accelerated despite years of training himself to maintain physiological control during high-stakes negotiations. This wasn't business. This was personal in ways that bypassed rational analysis and accessed something more primal. Marcus took the microphone first, a decision that surprised no one who understood his pathological need to control narratives. "I want to talk about someone who had so much potential." His opening line was delivered with the practiced cadence of a man who'd rehearsed this speech probably in front of mirrors, definitely in his imagination during the 4 years since learning his ex-wife had married a billionaire. An artist, brilliant, could have done anything with her talent and intelligence. Damien's jaw clenched hard enough that pain radiated through his skull. Marcus was deploying the gold digger narrative with surgical precision, establishing Elena's supposed abilities before contrasting them with her actual choices. The implication would be that she'd possessed genuine potential, but traded it for security that her current life represented moral failure rather than legitimate success. But she got lost along the way, gave up on her dreams, chose the easy path instead of the hard one. Security over struggle, a gilded cage instead of freedom. Marcus paused for effect, letting his words settle into the collective consciousness of people who'd known Elena when she was young and uncertain before she'd discovered the inheritance that transformed material circumstances without changing fundamental character. "I look at her now in that expensive dress wearing diamonds that cost more than most people earn in a lifetime, and I wonder if she even remembers who she used to be." The microphone captured scattered reactions, a few uncomfortable laughs, someone whispering commentary Damien couldn't quite parse, then a voice he didn't recognize, male and slightly slurred, offering support. "You're a good man, Marcus, still caring about her after everything." "I'll always care about Elena. She was my first love, my partner when I had nothing. I put everything into building a future for us, worked 80-hour weeks trying to establish my practice, sacrificed time and health because I believed we were building something together." Marcus's revision of history was breathtaking in its audacity. He'd erased Elena's financial contributions, her emotional labor, the inheritance money that paid for his bar exam and first office lease. In his version, he was the sole architect of success, and she the passive beneficiary who eventually abandoned the project. But people change. Priorities shift. And sometimes the person you think you know reveals themselves to be someone entirely different. Damien was gripping his phone with enough force that the case creaked ominously. Agent Morrison's voice cut through on a secondary channel, calm and professional. "Let him keep talking. Every word is evidence. He's establishing pattern of financial abuse and emotional manipulation. This is good for us." Good for the case, perhaps. Devastating for Elena, definitely. Damien could hear her breathing through the wire, shallow and controlled, the physiological signature of someone fighting panic through sheer willpower. He wanted to intervene immediately, wanted to walk into that country club and dismantle Marcus Sterling in front of everyone he'd ever tried to impress. But intervention now would undermine Elena's agency, would reinforce the very narrative Marcus was constructing about her helplessness and dependence. The saddest part isn't that she chose money over meaning, it's that I don't think she even realizes what she lost. Marcus had shifted into his concluding remarks, voice dropping into registers that suggested profound sorrow rather than vindictive judgment. "She's living in a beautiful prison surrounded by expensive things, married to a man she barely knows. And I see her face, and I see a ghost. A beautiful, expensive ghost who forgot how to be real." Silence followed, thick and uncomfortable. Then applause started, tentative at first, but building as people who didn't know better interpreted Marcus's performance as genuine concern rather than calculated cruelty. Damien heard Elena's breathing hitch, heard something that might have been a suppressed sob or possibly just audio distortion. Then her voice, quiet but clear, speaking to Vivian. "I need a minute. Don't follow me." Footsteps, the acoustic signature of someone moving quickly through crowds. Damien tracked Elena's location via her phone's GPS, watched as the blue dot representing her position moved from the ballroom toward what building schematics identified as the terrace. She was leaving the room seeking privacy, possibly on the edge of emotional collapse that would validate every lie Marcus had just told about her fragility and dependence. "Elena, wait." Morrison's voice cut through on the encrypted channel, urgent and commanding. "Don't leave the witnesses. If you break down alone, we lose the contrast. Stay visible. Show them you're fine." But she wasn't fine. Damien could hear it in her ragged breathing and the small sounds that suggested she was fighting tears through pure force of will. He'd promised not to intervene prematurely, promised to let her handle this confrontation on her terms according to her timeline. That promise was disintegrating against the reality of listening to someone he loved being systematically destroyed in front of an audience too ignorant to recognize abuse when it performed in evening wear. His security team was already moving before Damien consciously made the decision. "Get to Northgate Country Club, now. I don't care about traffic laws. Get there in 10 minutes or you're all fired." The threat was unnecessary but felt essential action translating into words because action itself was still minutes away. The charity gala's host approached with some question about auction items or dinner seating. Damien couldn't process specifics. He brushed past her with an apology that was pure reflex, no actual attention behind the words. His town car was already pulling up outside, driver having received telepathic instructions or possibly just recognizing the expression that meant everything else was subordinate to immediate departure. Elena's voice returned to the audio feed, stronger now, like she'd physically reassembled herself through willpower and muscle memory from therapy sessions about grounding techniques and cognitive reframing. "I'm okay. I just needed air. I'm going back inside." The declaration was more for herself than Vivian's self-directed reassurance that she could withstand further assault. "You don't have to. We have enough." Morrison said Marcus incriminated himself with the financial abuse implications. "We can end this now." Vivian's offer was tempting, Damien knew. Walk away. Claim victory. Let federal prosecutors handle the rest while Elena recovered in private from this public evisceration. "No. I need to respond. I need them to hear my version." Elena's determination carried the particular quality of someone who'd spent years being silenced and finally had the platform to speak. "He doesn't get to tell my story anymore. Not without me correcting the record." Damien's car accelerated through Chicago's evening traffic, driver navigating with the aggressive confidence of someone who understood that employment depended on speed. The GPS estimated 14 minutes to Northgate Country Club under current conditions. Damien pulled up security footage from his advanced team cameras positioned around the property's perimeter, capturing angles that would be useful later for documentation and potential legal proceedings. He could see Elena's figure on the terrace, silhouetted against lights from the golf course, Vivian standing beside her in what looked like fierce conference. Back inside the ballroom, Scott Reynolds had taken the microphone. "That was powerful, Marcus. Really vulnerable. I think we all remember when you and Elena were together how hard you worked, how supportive she was. It's tough when relationships don't work out, but you handled it with real class." His endorsement functioned as social proof, permission for others to accept Marcus's narrative without critical examination. Then another voice, this one Damien recognized from investigation files. Garrett Wallace, former computer science major, now CEO of a moderately successful app development company. He'd been peripheral to Elena and Marcus's social circle during college, friendly with both, but closer to Elena because they'd shared studio space during a semester when Wallace was taking art electives. I actually have a different perspective on that story. His intervention cut through the comfortable consensus Marcus had been building. "I remember Elena tutoring half our class through freshman composition. I remember her working 2 jobs while Marcus was in law school. And I specifically remember Marcus asking me to delete emails where he'd asked Elena to write sections of his papers because the ethics board was asking questions. The ballroom went quiet in the way rooms do when someone violates unspoken social contracts about maintaining pleasant fictions. Marcus's response came through the wire with barely controlled fury. "That's not what happened. You're misremembering. I have the emails still, never deleted them. Seemed like they might be important someday." Wallace's delivery was calm, factual, devastating in its refusal to engage with Marcus's defensive bluster. "I also remember you selling a painting Elena did of you, state competition winner. You told everyone she'd given it to you as a gift, but I heard you negotiating price with the collector, $50,000. Did Elena ever see any of that money?" Damien felt something fierce and grateful surge through his chest. Wallace was doing what good witnesses do, providing corroboration that transformed individual testimony into documented pattern. Marcus could dismiss Elena's version as biased recollection from an angry ex-wife. He couldn't dismiss a third party who had nothing to gain from intervention except the satisfaction of truth-telling. Marcus's voice had lost its smooth quality, replaced by something harder and more authentic. "This is ancient history. We're supposed to be celebrating how far we've come, not digging up old grievances. You're the one who brought it up. You spent 10 minutes talking about Elena like she was a cautionary tale. Garrett's just correcting the record." Vivian had returned to the ballroom, her voice cutting through with surgical precision. "And since we're correcting records, let's talk about the voicemail you left me in April 2019. Damien's pulse spiked. This was the moment. Vivian had the recording, the drunken message where Marcus had offered her $10,000 to testify that Elena had been unfaithful during their marriage. It was evidence of witness tampering, of malicious intent, of consciousness of guilt about financial malfeasance. Morrison had been clear that the recording alone wouldn't justify charges, but combined with everything else, it painted a portrait of someone who knew his version of events wouldn't survive scrutiny. "I don't know what you're talking about." Marcus's denial was immediate and unconvincing. "Then I'll refresh your memory." Vivian's phone connected to the country club's sound system through some technological magic Damien would normally appreciate, but currently had no bandwidth to analyze. Then Marcus's voice filled the ballroom, slurred and venomous and utterly damning. "Viv, listen, I need a favor. Tell people you saw Elena with someone. Doesn't matter who, just create doubt. I'll pay you 10 grand. Cash. She doesn't deserve anything from this divorce. She was dead weight the entire marriage." The recording continued for another 30 seconds, Marcus's voice growing more hostile as he detailed Elena's supposed failures and his own victimhood. Then silence. Complete, absolute silence that Damien could feel through the audio feed like physical pressure. Someone spoke finally, a woman's voice Damien didn't recognize. "Jesus, Marcus. I was drunk. Going through the worst time of my life. You can't hold that against me." Marcus's defense was weakening, his voice taking on a desperate quality that suggested he understood the foundation was crumbling beneath carefully constructed lies. "You tried to bribe me to commit perjury. That's a crime, Marcus. I didn't report it because Elena asked me not to. She said you were already spiraling and she didn't want to make it worse." Vivian's statement was strategically brilliant. She'd established both the crime and Elena's mercy, creating a contrast that would make Marcus's subsequent attacks seem even more egregious. Damien's car was 8 minutes out according to GPS. He could hear chaos in the ballroom now, multiple conversations erupting simultaneously as people processed revelations that contradicted the narrative they'd been fed. Some defending Marcus, citing stress and divorce trauma, others questioning what else might have been misrepresented. Social dynamics shifting in real time as information updated prior assumptions. Then Elena's voice cut through clear and steady, requesting the microphone. "I'd like to respond to Marcus's earlier comments if everyone doesn't mind, since we're apparently having truth-telling night." Her tone carried steel Damien recognized from board meetings and difficult negotiations. This was Elena in full command of herself, no longer the frightened woman on the terrace, but someone who'd remembered she had agency and intended to exercise it. I don't think that's necessary, Elena. Let's not make this uglier than it needs to be. Marcus was attempting to shut down her response, probably recognizing that his control of the narrative was disintegrating and desperate to prevent further damage. You spent 10 minutes making me a cautionary tale. I think I've earned 2 minutes for rebuttal. Elena's assertion of her right to speak was met with enough supporting murmurs that Marcus couldn't refuse without seeming threatened by her perspective. Marcus talked about our apartment in Wrigleyville, about counting pennies for pizza. What he didn't mention was who paid for that apartment. My grandmother's inheritance, $85,000 that was supposed to fund my graduate education in art history. Marcus convinced me to invest it in our future instead. His bar exam, his office deposit, his professional wardrobe. I never saw a dollar returned. Damien could hear the shift in room dynamics even through audio transmission. People were listening differently now, processing information through frameworks that acknowledged possibility of deception. Elena continued, her voice gaining strength as she progressed through verifiable facts that contradicted Marcus's mythology. He mentioned the painting. I won state competition my junior year. A portrait I spent 3 months completing. Marcus told me he donated it to a school fundraiser. What he actually did was sell it to a private collector for $50,000, forging my signature on the bill of sale. I didn't discover this until 3 years after our divorce, when the collector contacted me requesting additional work. She paused, letting the implications settle. Forgery, fraud, theft. I have the documentation, the collector's testimony, the forensic analysis of the signature. Marcus Sterling built his early career on my labor and my inheritance, then revised history to erase my contributions entirely. Someone in the crowd spoke up, a male voice that carried skepticism. If that's true, why didn't you press charges? Why wait until now to bring it up? Because I was convinced I was worthless. Because Marcus spent 7 years telling me I was too emotional, too irrational, too unstable to be believed. Because I thought maybe I had misremembered, maybe I was being vindictive, maybe his version was closer to truth than mine. Elena's voice cracked slightly authentic emotion, breaking through practiced composure. It took years of therapy and distance and the support of people who didn't have a vested interest in my diminishment to realize that my memories were accurate and his revisions were self-serving lies. Damien's car pulled into Northgate Country Club's circular drive with enough velocity that gravel scattered beneath tires. His security team was already there, positioned near entrances, communicating via encrypted radio about optimal entry points and potential complications. Morrison's van was parked in shadows near the service entrance, sophisticated recording equipment capturing audio that would eventually become evidence in federal proceedings. "We have a problem." Morrison's voice cut through on Damien's private channel, urgent and concerned. "Sterling just received a text. Someone tipped him off about FBI surveillance. He's looking around the room like he's trying to identify threats." Damien was already moving, crossing manicured lawns toward the country club's main entrance. "Who sent the text? How did they know?" "Working on it. But he's spooked. He might lawyer up and stop talking. We need to move now or risk losing everything." Morrison's tactical assessment was sound. Subjects who knew they were being recorded became cautious. Consulted attorneys stopped incriminating themselves through voluntary statements. The entire operation depended on Marcus feeling secure enough to continue his performance. "Give me 2 minutes before you move. I'm going in." Damien didn't wait for approval. This was Elena's operation, ultimately her decision about timing and tactics, but circumstances had evolved beyond original parameters. If Marcus was about to shut down, they needed maximum pressure to force mistakes. The country club's interior was exactly as architectural plans had suggested. Marble floors crown molding portraits of past club presidents arranged in descending order of importance. Damien could hear voices from the ballroom. Elena's among them, still speaking with remarkable composure given the circumstances. He paused outside the entrance, adjusting his tuxedo, preparing the expression he wanted witnesses to see. Not angry, not aggressive, just calm certainty, the bearing of someone who had resources and willingness to deploy them without hesitation. His entrance was deliberately timed. He pushed open the ballroom doors during a moment of relative quiet when Elena had just finished explaining how the Art Institute of Chicago had offered her an associate curator position that Marcus convinced her to decline because it would require evening hours he needed her available for entertaining clients. The doors swung wide and 50 heads turned toward the interruption. Damien walked directly to Elena, not acknowledging anyone else in the room. He took her hand, raised it to his lips, pressed a kiss to her knuckles that was intimate and possessive, and meant to communicate unmistakable support. "I'm sorry I'm late. The gala ran longer than expected." His voice carried perfectly in the acoustic space conversation-level volume that nonetheless projected authority. Marcus Sterling was staring at him with an expression that cycled through confusion, recognition, and something approaching terror. Damien met his gaze without hostility, just cool assessment of the type he deployed in boardrooms when competitors realized too late they were outmatched. "Mr. Sterling, we haven't been formally introduced. I'm Damien Cross, Elena's husband." The room's energy shifted dramatically. People who'd been skeptical of Elena's account were suddenly reconsidering based purely on Damien's presence. Wealth conferred credibility in spaces like this, and Damien wore his status like tailored armor. Marcus had positioned himself as the self-made success, the grinder who'd built everything from nothing. Damien's existence in Elena's life undermined that narrative by demonstrating she had access to resources that dwarfed anything Marcus had achieved. "I know who you are." Marcus's voice carried defensive hostility that made several people wince at the breach of social protocol. "What are you doing here?" "Supporting my wife. She mentioned she was attending her high school reunion and I wanted to surprise her." The lie was smooth practiced, delivered with the casual confidence of someone who never expected to be challenged. "I'm glad I did. This has been very illuminating." Behind Damien, the ballroom doors opened again. Agent Morrison entered, flanked by 2 other federal agents whose credentials were visible even from distance. Their presence changed the atmosphere instantly from social gathering to something else entirely, something official and potentially dangerous. Morrison approached Marcus, directly ignoring everyone else in the room. "Marcus Sterling, I'm Special Agent Morrison with the FBI. We need to speak with you regarding your financial activities and potential violations of federal law." Marcus's face went through a remarkable transformation, color draining, until he looked almost gray under the ballroom's chandelier lighting. "I want my attorney. I'm not saying anything without legal representation." "That's your right. But I should inform you that we have recordings from this evening where you made statements we believe constitute admission of financial fraud and identity theft. You used your ex-wife's maiden name to establish a shell corporation that laundered money for criminal organizations. We have documentation, we have witness testimony, and we have your voice on tape discussing these activities." Morrison's delivery was professional, almost bored, reciting facts that would destroy Marcus's life with the same energy most people use to order coffee. The ballroom erupted in chaos. Multiple conversations, people pulling out phones to record or text someone asking loudly if this was some kind of prank. Damien kept his attention on Elena, watching her face cycle through emotions that ranged from vindication to shock to something approaching grief. She'd wanted justice, but perhaps hadn't fully processed what justice would look like when it arrived wearing FBI credentials and speaking in law enforcement monotone. "Elena, did you know about this?" Marcus's question cut through the noise, direct and accusing. "Did you set me up?" She met his gaze without flinching. "I cooperated with an ongoing federal investigation. That's different from setting someone up. You set yourself up by committing crimes. This is about the divorce, about money. You couldn't stand that I moved on, that I built a life without you." Marcus was deteriorating rapidly, his practiced composure fragmenting under pressure that exceeded his capacity to perform confidence. "This is about justice, about accountability, about you finally facing consequences for actions you thought you'd never have to answer for." Elena's voice remained steady, but Damien could feel her trembling slightly where their hands remained connected. "You stole from me. You forged my signature. You used my name to commit federal crimes. Those aren't relationship disputes, Marcus. Those are felonies." Morrison gestured toward the exit. "Mr. Sterling, we can continue this conversation at our field office. You're not under arrest at this moment, but we do need you to come with us for formal questioning." "Am I being arrested or not? I need a clear answer." Marcus was attempting to regain control through procedural technicalities, lawyer instincts, activating even as his criminal exposure became undeniable. "Not yet, but if you refuse to cooperate voluntarily, that status will change very quickly." Morrison's implication was clear. They had enough for arrest, but were offering Marcus the dignity of walking out under his own power instead of being handcuffed in front of his former classmates. Damien watched Marcus calculate options, seeing intelligence operate behind panic. He could refuse force arrest, create a scene that would dominate social media and news cycles, or he could comply, maintain some shred of dignity, hope that cooperation might mitigate eventual charges. The second option was obviously superior from any rational perspective, but rationality had abandoned Marcus somewhere between Vivian's voicemail and Morrison's arrival. "This isn't over, Elena. You think you won, but you just destroyed any credibility you ever had. Everyone in this room now knows you married for money, and you're using that money to persecute someone who loved you." Marcus's final performance was desperate and unconvincing, the last gasp of someone whose ability to control narrative had finally expired. Elena stepped away from Damien, approached Marcus directly close enough that her next words would be captured clearly by every phone recording the confrontation. "I married Damien because he saw me as a complete person instead of a resource to exploit. And I'm not persecuting you, Marcus. I'm simply refusing to protect you from consequences of your own choices. There's a difference." Those would be the words that circulated on social media, Damien knew. The soundbite that defined Elena's transformation from victim to survivor to someone who claimed agency without apology. He felt something settle in his chest, pride mixed with relief that she'd navigated this confrontation without losing herself to rage or grief. Morrison escorted Marcus toward the exit, two agents flanking him in a formation that was professional but unmistakably custodial. The ballroom doors closed behind them, and the space erupted in conversation that Damien made no effort to monitor. His attention was entirely on Elena, who'd turned back toward him with an expression that was complicated and raw and beautiful in its honesty. "Take me home." Her request was quiet enough that only Damien heard it. "Please, I need to leave." "Of course." He kept his arm around her as they moved toward a different exit, one that bypassed the main entrance and the journalists who were undoubtedly already gathering after monitoring police scanners. Security team formed a perimeter professional and unobtrusive clearing path through curious onlookers and opportunistic photographers. The ride home was silent except for Elena's occasional shaky breaths. Damien held her hand, offered presence, without demanding conversation, understood that she was processing trauma and triumph simultaneously and needed space for both. They'd won tonight. Marcus Sterling was facing federal charges that would likely result in prison time. Elena had publicly reclaimed her narrative and demonstrated strength that contradicted every lie Marcus had told about her weakness. But victory felt hollow in the way justice often does when it arrives too late to prevent damage. Years of abuse couldn't be undone by a single evening of vindication. Therapy would continue. Nightmares would probably persist. The work of healing was never truly finished, just managed with greater skill and support. Back at the penthouse, Elena removed the necklace, carefully handed it to Damien like it was evidence she needed logged. "I want to keep this. Not just the diamonds, but what it represents. That I survived him. That I was strong enough to face him and not break." Her voice was steady now, grounded in decision that came from certainty rather than reaction. "It's yours. Always was." Damien secured the necklace in the safe, then returned to find Elena standing at the window overlooking Chicago's nighttime sprawl. She looked smaller somehow, like the evening had extracted something essential and left her diminished despite victory. He approached slowly, wrapped arms around her from behind, felt her lean back into him, with the trust that still sometimes surprised him with its completeness. "You were extraordinary tonight. I'm so proud of you." The words felt inadequate but necessary acknowledgement that she'd done something remarkable under circumstances designed to break her. "I don't feel extraordinary. I feel exhausted and sad and relieved and angry all at the same time." Her confession was raw, unfiltered by the composure she'd maintained for hours. He's going to prison. That should feel like winning. But mostly it just feels like the end of something that never should have started. That's wisdom, not weakness. You can be right about justice and still grieve the years that were stolen. Damien had learned this lesson across multiple contexts. Winning didn't erase cost. It just meant cost had purchased something valuable instead of nothing at all. They stood together as the city glittered beneath them. Two people who'd found each other in circumstances designed to prevent connection, building something that survived because it was rooted in truth instead of performance. The federal courthouse in downtown Chicago looked like something designed to intimidate through architecture alone, all granite columns and imposing stairs that required physical effort to ascend. Damien stood at the base of those steps 3 months after the reunion, watching news crews position cameras and reporters rehearse opening lines for segments that would dominate evening broadcasts. Marcus Sterling's arraignment was scheduled for 10 o'clock, and media coverage had transformed a routine legal proceeding into spectacle that said more about American fascination with fallen success stories than actual jurisprudence. Elena had chosen not to attend. She'd made that decision 2 weeks ago after her therapist helped her recognize that witnessing Marcus in handcuffs wouldn't provide the closure she imagined. Healing wasn't transactional. It didn't follow neat trajectories where specific events triggered definitive transformations. It was messy and nonlinear, and sometimes involved choosing absence over confrontation when presence served no therapeutic purpose. Damien respected her decision, even as part of him wished she could see Marcus's empire collapse in real-time witness, the physical manifestation of consequences finally arriving after years of impunity. Agent Morrison emerged from a black SUV flanked by federal prosecutors, whose expressions conveyed the particular confidence of people holding unbeatable hands. The case against Marcus had grown substantially since that night at Northgate Country Club. Forensic accountants had traced money through shell corporations and offshore accounts, documenting a pattern of systematic fraud that extended beyond what Damien's initial investigation had uncovered. Marcus hadn't just laundered money for the Castellano organization. He'd been running a parallel scheme involving client funds, taking advance payments for legal services, and investing them in high-risk ventures that occasionally succeeded, but more often failed spectacularly, leaving him scrambling to cover shortfalls before clients noticed their retainers had been gambled away. Morrison spotted Damien, offered a subtle nod that acknowledged their collaboration without making it obvious to watching journalists. They'd maintained careful distance since the arrest, preserving prosecutorial integrity and avoiding any appearance that Damien's wealth had influenced federal law enforcement. The relationship was legitimate, but optics mattered, especially in cases where defendants would inevitably claim persecution by powerful enemies rather than accountability for documented crimes. The courthouse doors opened and Marcus appeared, flanked by attorneys who'd charged him $600 per hour to deliver bad news about plea bargain terms that involved substantial prison time, regardless of how cooperative he became. Marcus looked diminished in ways that transcended physical appearance. His suit was expensive but ill-fitting, like he'd lost weight rapidly through stress rather than intentional effort. His expression carried the hollow quality of someone who'd finally accepted that reality wouldn't bend to accommodate preferred narratives. Their eyes met across 50 yards of concrete and camera equipment. Damien held the contact without aggression or satisfaction, just steady acknowledgement of this moment's inevitability. Marcus had built his existence on lies that required constant maintenance and infinite self-deception. The structure was always going to collapse. Damien had simply accelerated the timeline and ensured Elena wasn't buried in the rubble. Marcus looked away first, allowing his attorneys to guide him up the courthouse steps toward proceedings that would formalize what everyone already understood. His legal career was finished. His freedom was measured in months before federal prison claimed years. Everything he'd stolen and built and defended through manipulation would be dismantled piece by piece, until only truth remained stark and unforgiving. Damien's phone buzzed with a text from Elena. "How are you feeling?" 3 words that contained multitudes. She was checking on him because she understood this wasn't just legal strategy or financial maneuvering. It was personal in ways that bypassed professional detachment. Damien had developed genuine hatred for Marcus Sterling, the kind that didn't fade with victory, but required active management to prevent it from becoming corrosive. He typed back carefully. "Satisfied but not celebratory. He's going to prison, and that's appropriate, but it doesn't undo what he did to you." The response felt inadequate but honest. Justice was necessary, but insufficient. Elena's nightmares would continue. Her hypervigilance in relationships would persist. Marcus's sentencing wouldn't restore the years he'd stolen or repair neural pathways damaged by sustained abuse. Inside, the courthouse proceedings unfolded with bureaucratic efficiency. Marcus pled not guilty despite overwhelming evidence, a formality that preserved his right to trial, while everyone in the room understood conviction was inevitable. The judge set bail at $2 million in amount. Marcus's attorneys argued was excessive, given their client's cooperation and lack of flight risk. The prosecution countered with documentation of offshore accounts and passport applications Marcus had filed under assumed names, suggesting flight risk was precisely the concern that justified high bail. The judge sided with prosecutors. Marcus would remain in federal custody pending trial unless he could produce $2 million in cash or assets sufficient to secure bonding. Given that most of his wealth was frozen pending asset forfeiture proceedings, custody seemed inevitable. Damien watched Marcus absorb this reality, saw the moment comprehension crystallized that he'd spend the next 6 months minimum in detention facilities designed for people awaiting trial on serious federal charges. Afterward, Morrison joined Damien in a coffee shop 3 blocks from the courthouse, one of those anonymous chains where anonymity was guaranteed through sheer ordinariness. They sat in a corner booth, Morrison with black coffee, and Damien with espresso that tasted like burnt resignation. "The trial will probably start in 8 months, maybe sooner if Sterling's attorneys push for speedy resolution, but I doubt they will. Time works in their favor, lets witnesses' memories fade, increases chances of procedural errors they can exploit on appeal." "What's your confidence level on conviction?" Damien knew the answer, but needed to hear it articulated by someone whose professional judgment wasn't compromised by personal investment. 95%. We have his voice on recordings discussing illegal activity. We have bank records showing money movement through shell companies. We have the accountant from his firm willing to testify about how he pressured her to falsify records. And we have Elena's testimony about the forged signature and stolen inheritance money, which establishes pattern of financial malfeasance predating the money laundering. Morrison's assessment was clinical, reducing human tragedy to evidentiary components that would persuade juries. The only real question is sentencing length. Federal guidelines suggest 12 to 15 years for the counts we're pursuing. With cooperation, that could drop to 8 or 9. Without cooperation, it could climb to 20. 20 years would make Marcus 55, when released assuming good behavior and no additional charges. His legal career would be permanently finished. His social standing would be destroyed beyond any possibility of rehabilitation. He'd emerge from prison into a world that had moved on completely from whatever relevance he'd once possessed. Elena wants to write something. An essay about how controlling money is one of the primary tools abusers use to trap victims. Damien had been thinking about this proposal constantly since Elena first mentioned it. The piece could help other people recognize patterns in their own relationships, could illuminate dynamics that often remained invisible until damage was catastrophic. She's wondering if she should publish under her name or anonymously. I think she should own it completely, use her platform to make maximum impact. Morrison considered this while consuming coffee that must have been scalding based on the steam rising from his cup. From a prosecutorial standpoint, I can't advise either way. Her testimony is going to be public record regardless. The trial will generate media coverage. People will know her story whether she publishes an essay or not. So the question is really whether she wants to control that narrative proactively or let journalists frame it for her. The analysis was sound. Media would cover the trial extensively, would interview classmates from the reunion, and colleagues from Marcus's firm would construct narratives that served their editorial perspectives rather than Elena's lived experience. Better to establish the authoritative version before that process began. Claim ownership of the story in ways that made subsequent reframing more difficult. Damien's phone rang with a call from his head of security. "We have a situation at the penthouse. Someone tried to access the service entrance claiming to be making a delivery. Security stopped them and discovered they're a journalist from Chicago Tribune looking for interview with Mrs. Cross. Get their credentials, verify employment, then inform them that any interview requests need to go through our attorney. And increase perimeter security. If one journalist found the service entrance, others will try." Damien ended the call, returned attention to Morrison, who'd been monitoring the conversation with professional interest. "It's starting. Media attention escalating beyond what we anticipated. Sterling's attorneys are probably encouraging it. Can't win in court, so they'll try to win in public opinion, frame him as victim of vengeful ex-wife who married into money and used those resources to destroy him. Classic strategy when facts aren't on your side." Morrison's familiarity with defense tactics was both reassuring and exhausting. Every move had a counter-move. Every truth could be reframed as perspective. Justice required constant vigilance against narrative manipulation. Damien returned to the penthouse to find Elena in her studio, the converted bedroom where she'd resumed painting after years of believing Marcus's assessment that her art was mediocre hobby rather than legitimate expression. The current piece was abstract, all dark blues and sharp angles that suggested emotional landscape rather than physical representation. She was working with focused intensity that indicated she'd entered the flow state where time became irrelevant and only the canvas mattered. He watched from the doorway without interrupting, appreciating both the art and the artist. Elena had changed substantially in the 4 years since their marriage. Not just externally, though her confidence had transformed posture and presence in observable ways. The deeper shift was internal, a reconstruction of self-concept that therapy and distance from Marcus had enabled, but that ultimately she'd accomplished through sheer determination to remember who she'd been before someone convinced her she was worthless. She noticed him eventually set down her brush with the careful precision of someone who'd learned that cleaning supplies properly extended their utility. "How did it go? Is he in custody?" "Bail said at $2 million. He can't post it. He'll stay in federal detention until trial." Damien crossed the room, careful to avoid stepping on drop cloths protecting hardwood floors from paint spatter. "Morrison thinks conviction is near certainty. Sentencing could range from 8 to 20 years depending on cooperation and judicial discretion." Elena absorbed this information without visible reaction, processing implications in the methodical way she approached complex problems. "So it's really happening. He's actually going to prison." The statement was factual rather than triumphant acknowledgement of reality, rather than celebration of enemy's downfall. "Does that feel like closure for you? Or just another step in a longer process?" Damien genuinely didn't know the answer. Everyone talked about closure like it was a destination you reached after sufficient justice or revenge or time. His experience suggested it was more like a direction you moved toward without ever fully arriving. "Both, I think. It's validation that my memories were accurate and his revisions were lies. That matters psychologically. But it doesn't undo the 7 years I spent believing I was the problem." Elena wiped her hands on a rag already saturated with various paint colors, creating patterns that were accidentally beautiful. "I've been thinking about that essay. About writing publicly about what he did and how this pattern works. I think I need to do it. Not for him, not even primarily for other victims, though. I hope it helps. I need to do it for myself to prove I can tell my own story without his permission or approval." This was the Elena that Damien had fallen in love with, the one who approached difficult decisions with clear-eyed assessment of costs and benefits rather than avoidance disguised as patience. "Then do it. I'll support you however you need. Legal review to ensure we're not creating problems for the prosecution. Security consultation for managing increased attention. Editorial assistance if you want feedback. Whatever serves you best." She smiled at him with the particular warmth that still occasionally caught him off guard with its undefended affection. "I love that you always ask what I need instead of telling me what you think I should do." Marcus would have already written the essay himself and told me to sign it. The comparison wasn't bitter, just observational, noting patterns that had taken years to recognize as aberrant rather than normal. The essay took 3 weeks to write, going through 17 drafts, as Elena refined both content and tone. She shared it with her therapist, with Vivian, with Damien, incorporating feedback that strengthened arguments without diluting her voice. The final version was 5,000 words that traced the arc of her relationship with Marcus, detailing specific incidents and how they'd accumulated into comprehensive imprisonment disguised as partnership. She described the inheritance money Marcus had convinced her to invest in his education and career money that was supposed to fund her graduate studies, but was redirected with promises of future returns that never materialized. She explained how he'd controlled their joint bank account, how she'd needed his permission for purchases beyond groceries, how he'd criticized her spending on art supplies while buying himself luxury watches and expensive dinners with colleagues she wasn't invited to join. She detailed the portrait incident, how discovering he'd sold her work without permission had made her question her own sanity, because Marcus insisted she must have forgotten giving him authorization. The piece concluded with wisdom earned through survival. If this story helps even one person recognize those patterns in their own relationship and seek help before years are stolen, then sharing it was worthwhile. Your memories are valid, your perceptions are accurate, and you deserve a life where your worth isn't subject to someone else's approval. They published it in The Atlantic, a venue that reached educated audiences likely to engage seriously rather than treat it as gossip fodder. The essay went live on a Tuesday morning and within 6 hours had generated over 50,000 shares across social media platforms. Comment sections filled with people sharing their own experiences, thanking Elena for articulating dynamics they'd struggled to name, asking for resources about escaping similar situations. Some responses were predictably hostile. Anonymous accounts accused Elena of exaggeration and attention-seeking, insisted Marcus's version of events was closer to truth, suggested wealthy women complaining about abuse, trivialized real victims who lacked resources to escape. Damien had anticipated this reaction and prepared Elena for it, but reading actual comments that dismissed her trauma as performance was still viscerally enraging. "Don't read them. Seriously, stop scrolling." He physically took her phone away, set it on a table beyond easy reach. People who've never experienced abuse will always question victims. It's how they maintain the illusion that bad things only happen to people who make mistakes, that they're safe because they're smart enough to avoid dangerous people. Engaging with that delusion is pointless. Elena nodded, but he could see the comments had activated doubt she'd been working for years to overcome. What if they're right? What if I am exaggerating? Memory is unreliable. Maybe some of what I remember didn't happen exactly the way I described it. Your memories are corroborated by documentation, bank records showing money movement, emails where Marcus explicitly told you not to spend on certain things, the collector's testimony about the forged signature. This isn't recovered memory syndrome or false accusations based on therapy-induced confabulation. This is documented fraud. Damien kept his voice level despite fury at watching her second-guess herself because strangers on the internet had weaponized skepticism. And even if some details are imperfect, the pattern is undeniable. He controlled your money. He sold your work without permission. He convinced you that your perceptions were wrong. Those are facts that his own attorneys aren't disputing because they can't. The essay's publication created ripple effects that extended beyond personal vindication. Domestic violence organizations contacted Elena requesting permission to use excerpts in educational materials. Law schools invited her to speak about her experience and how legal systems often fail to recognize economic coercion as distinct form of abuse worthy of protective orders and criminal prosecution. Publishing houses offered six-figure advances for a full memoir, which Elena declined because she wasn't ready to commodify her trauma at that scale. Marcus's attorneys tried to use the essay against her, filing motions claiming it constituted prejudicial publicity that would make fair trial impossible. The judge denied the motion with an opinion that noted, Defendants don't get to commit crimes publicly, then demand victims remain silent about their experiences. Elena's essay was protected speech. If Marcus found that inconvenient, he should have considered that possibility before engaging in behavior that generated compelling narratives. The trial started 9 months after the arraignment, occupying a courtroom on the 14th floor of the federal building where Damien had once negotiated contracts that moved more money than most people would see in 10 lifetimes. He attended every day of proceedings, sitting in the gallery 3 rows behind the prosecution table, where he could see Elena when she testified, but wasn't so close that his presence might be construed as intimidation. Jury selection took a week, prosecutors and defense attorneys evaluating potential jurors for biases that might predispose them toward conviction or acquittal. The final panel was 7 women and 5 men, ranging from a retired teacher to a software engineer to a construction supervisor who'd served in the Army before civilian life. Demographics that suggested reasonable cross-section of community people capable of evaluating evidence without predetermined conclusions. Opening statements established the battlefield. Prosecutors painted Marcus as a sophisticated criminal who'd exploited his legal training to construct elaborate fraud schemes disguised as legitimate business operations. Defense attorneys countered with narratives about aggressive ex-wife weaponizing federal prosecutors to pursue personal vendetta about rushed investigation motivated by political pressure rather than actual evidence. Neither version was entirely accurate, but both contained enough truth to seem plausible depending on which facts you prioritized. Elena testified on day 4 wearing a Navy suit that projected professional competence without ostentation. Damien watched her take the oath, swearing to tell the truth, as if truth was singular and accessible rather than complicated and perspective-dependent. The prosecutor led her through her history with Marcus, establishing timeline and relationship dynamics that contextualized everything within larger pattern of control. Did there come a time when Marcus Sterling asked you to invest your inheritance in his legal education? The prosecutor's questions were straightforward, designed to elicit facts without editorializing. Yes, I'd received $85,000 from my grandmother's estate. It was designated for my graduate education in art history. Marcus was studying for the bar exam and said he couldn't afford the preparation course and exam fees. He asked if we could use my inheritance temporarily with the understanding he'd repay it once his practice was established. Elena's voice remained steady, factual, refusing to inject emotion that defense attorneys could characterize as bias or vindictiveness. Was the money repaid? No. When I asked about repayment 2 years later, Marcus said we'd discussed it being a gift rather than a loan. He became angry when I disputed that recollection, told me I was being petty and manipulative. The statement hung in air, letting jurors process the irony of someone who'd taken $85,000, accusing the lender of manipulation. Defense cross-examination attempted to establish that Elena had given the money freely, without expectation of return, that any subsequent disputes arose from buyer's remorse rather than actual deception. Elena handled the questioning with remarkable composure, never becoming defensive or hostile, simply restating facts as she remembered them and acknowledging when she couldn't recall specific details. The portrait incident generated even more dramatic testimony. Elena explained how she'd won state competition, how Marcus had claimed to donate the painting to fundraiser, how she'd discovered years later that he'd actually sold it and kept the proceeds. The prosecutor introduced the collector's testimony. The signature analysis showing Elena's signature on the bill of sale was forged. The documentation of Marcus receiving $50,000 for work he didn't own and hadn't created. Defense tried to suggest Elena had authorized the sale and forgotten that the signature analysis was inconclusive, that the collector might have been confused about transaction details. But the evidence was overwhelming. Marcus had forged her signature to steal her work. The crime was documented and undeniable. Damien's contribution to the trial was limited but strategic. He testified about meeting Elena, about learning of Marcus's actions, about his decision to support federal investigation, not out of personal animosity, but because crimes had been committed and justice required accountability. Defense attorneys tried to paint him as vindictive billionaire using wealth to persecute Elena's ex-husband, but the characterization didn't survive scrutiny. Damien had provided information to FBI, had facilitated Elena's cooperation, but he hadn't manufactured evidence or pressured witnesses. He'd simply ensured that crimes already committed came to appropriate attention. The most damaging testimony came from Marcus's former accountant, the woman who'd moved to Oregon to escape his influence. She described in detail how Marcus had pressured her to falsify records, to categorize personal expenses as business costs, to hide money movement through shell companies that had no legitimate purpose. She'd resisted initially, but Marcus had threatened her job, had suggested she'd be implicated in any investigations, had created an environment where cooperation seemed like survival rather than choice. "Why didn't you report this to authorities when it was happening?" The prosecutor asked the obvious question, knowing defense would attack her credibility based on delayed disclosure. "I was scared. Marcus is a lawyer. He knew how to make threats without leaving evidence. He convinced me that if I reported him, I'd go to prison alongside him because I'd touched the records." Her voice broke slightly, genuine emotion that couldn't be manufactured or performed. "And I needed the job. I was supporting 2 kids and my salary was barely enough. Marcus knew that. He weaponized my vulnerability." Defense tried to suggest she was lying to avoid prosecution herself, that immunity deal she'd received from FBI was compensation for fabricated testimony. But her story corroborated too many other pieces of evidence. Bank records confirmed money had moved exactly as she described. Other employees testified about Marcus's controlling behavior and subtle intimidation. The pattern was unmistakable to anyone willing to see it. Deliberations lasted 3 days, suggesting jurors were taking their responsibility seriously rather than rushing to judgment. Damien spent those days in a state of controlled anxiety, maintaining work obligations while mentally running through every piece of evidence and wondering if they'd done enough to overcome reasonable doubt. Elena was calmer externally, but he could see tension in the way she held her shoulders, the frequency with which she checked her phone for updates that wouldn't come until verdicts were reached. The call came on a Thursday afternoon. Jury had reached decisions. All parties should return to courthouse for verdict reading. Damien and Elena drove downtown in silence, both of them processing the reality that years of preparation and months of trial were about to resolve into binary outcome: guilty or not guilty, justice or bitter disappointment. The courtroom was packed with journalists and interested observers, people drawn to spectacle of powerful person facing accountability. Marcus sat at the defense table, looking smaller than Damien remembered, diminished by months in detention and stress of trial that had systematically dismantled his carefully constructed self-image. Their eyes met briefly. Marcus's expression contained something that might have been hatred or possibly just exhausted recognition that the game was finished and he'd lost comprehensively. The judge called the court to order. The jury foreman, the retired teacher who'd impressed Damien during selection with her thoughtful responses, stood to deliver verdicts. Count 1 money laundering, guilty. Count 2 wire fraud, guilty. Count 3 identity theft, guilty. The pattern continued through 18 separate counts, guilty verdicts on every charge. Marcus's face remained impassive, but Damien saw his hands trembling where they rested on the table, betraying emotion his expression refused to acknowledge. Sentencing was scheduled for 6 weeks later, allowing time for pre-sentence reports and victim impact statements. Elena would have opportunity to address the court to describe in her own words how Marcus's crimes had damaged her. The judge would consider that testimony along with federal guidelines before determining appropriate punishment. Outside the courthouse, Elena stopped on the steps where Marcus had walked just months earlier. She looked out over the city, Chicago's skyline visible in the distance, traffic moving below with indifferent continuity. "I thought I'd feel more. Relief or satisfaction or closure, but mostly I just feel tired." That's because closure isn't real. It's something people talk about like it's a finish line you cross and then everything is better. But actually it's just acknowledgement that something ended, not that the ending fixed everything that came before. Damien had learned this lesson across multiple contexts. Winning didn't erase damage. It just meant damage had been acknowledged and addressed rather than ignored. They drove home through early evening traffic, both lost in separate contemplation of what victory actually meant when measured against years of abuse that would require ongoing therapy and constant vigilance to prevent from defining Elena's entire existence. Justice mattered. Accountability was essential. But healing would take longer than any criminal proceeding, would require daily choices to remember her worth when conditioned responses suggested otherwise. The penthouse felt different when they entered, though nothing physical had changed. Same furniture, same artwork, same view of the city glittering beneath gathering darkness. But the psychological weight that had pressed down for years had lifted fractionally enough that breathing came easier, and the future felt less like inevitable trauma and more like possibility earned through survival. Elena changed out of her suit, emerged in comfortable clothes that suggested she was done performing for any audience. She found Damien on the terrace looking out over the city they'd both chosen as home. "Thank you. For everything. For believing me when I didn't believe myself. For building the case. For standing beside me through all of this. You don't thank people for doing what love requires. I just made sure you had the tools to defend yourself. You're the one who did the actual work." Damien pulled her close, felt her settle against him with the particular relaxation that came from finally being safe after extended threat. They stood together as the city transformed beneath them, lights coming on in windows across thousands of buildings, each one containing stories of struggle and survival that would never be documented or resolved through criminal proceedings. Marcus Sterling's conviction was victory, certainly. But the real victory was Elena remembering that she'd never needed his approval or validation, that her worth was intrinsic and undiminished by someone else's inability to recognize it.